Last time we talked about modern Dragon Ball Z movies. They were a fairly good attempt at reviving the series overall. Battle of Gods was definitely the better movie and less drawn out than its follow up, but I fairly enjoyed bits of both of the movies. They had great animation and fun characters, even though the Super Saiyan forms were a bit stupid. And of course, with the success of the modern Dragon Ball Z movies, they spawned Dragon Ball Super. And this show actually readapted those movies, but did a considerably worse job, especially with the rushed animation. Dragon Ball Super definitely grew on people over time, but it wasn't instantly critically acclaimed as a series like Z was. People still watched it because it was Dragon Ball, of course, and the first time Goku went Ultra Instinct, it somehow crashed the Crunchyroll servers, I guess? Alright. So, after Super was over, there was a movie set to follow the Tournament of Power arc. However, this movie was special because it had a new art style, but we'll get to that later. But of course, that movie was Dragon Ball Super Broly. So, let's talk about it, I guess. So this movie came out in late 2018 in Japan and early 2019 in the West, to very massive success. It was well received for being fun and entertaining, as well as having a better and more focused story than the last few movies. So, is this movie really as good as we thought it was back in 2019? The answer to that is absolutely fucking yes. This movie is the best modern Dragon Ball movie, and definitely my favorite Dragon Ball movie ever. The beginning of this movie was interesting. I feel like if I described that the first 20 to 30 minutes were not really about Goku or Vegeta to any Dragon Ball fans, it would definitely be a bit of a turnoff, but it actually works in the movie's favor. We get a lot of backstory for Frieza, Paragus, and Broly, and how they each influenced each other throughout the years. It also adapts the Dragon Ball Minus comic, with Goku's origin story and his parents and whatnot. Now, I definitely would say that that part could have definitely been cut, but it works so well that I really don't even care enough to criticize it fundamentally. And it makes for a great transition into the main characters. It's a really good introduction to this movie, and it also works as segue into the main story. I won't pretend that every movie should start like this exactly, but it was creative and impactful in terms of opening this movie. In this intro, you might have noticed something different about the visuals. For this movie, they actually drew it in a completely different art style, and it looks great. It was drawn in the Shintani style, created by animation director Naohiro Shintani. I remember seeing the concept art for this, and thinking that it would look a little too cartoony and simplistic, but seeing it in motion, it looks really good. It perfectly walks the line between simplicity and complexity. The characters are more flat looking, yes, and overall less shaded, but still have their own special details that makes them, well, themselves. The shading is definitely flatter than last time, but there's still a fair amount of shading for all the characters, but it's pretty minimalistic. I especially like the fact that, like the other movies, the characters are still incredibly expressive, and even if they're drawn more simply, they still have complex components. The animation also works fairly well for the action scenes, which we'll talk about later. Overall, the animation and art is absolutely amazing. And I would definitely say that it looks a lot closer to classic Dragon Ball Z than Super did. Even though I did say that that one was definitely more of a reinterpretation of Dragon Ball Z, it felt a little too solid to match that style, if that makes any sense. This movie looks great and even has visual diversity in spite of taking place in one arena for the whole movie. The characters in the movie are also really well utilized. The main characters don't get as much development as Broly, and I think that's fine. This movie focuses a lot on Broly and his father, and it works great. I especially liked his backstory a lot more than the non-canon one. Yeah, that's a lot to get into. Yeah, the other Broly got really pissed because Goku started crying, I guess. What a little bit. I would say the new Broly is a lot better, because he's fairly sympathetic. While I do sometimes like villains who are just hammy and evil for the sake of being hammy and evil, as long as they have somewhat of a personality, which this series is pretty much known for at this point. I do indeed like when villains have their own struggles. Broly struggles that he's been trained to be basically a killing machine due to his abnormally high power level, and therefore, because of these several years of being isolated on a planet with his father, and him being used for a lot of violent things on that planet, along with Frieza basically taking advantage of this, seeing how powerful he is. He just can't really think for himself. He's not exactly a normal guy like everyone else here is, or at least as normal as a Dragon Ball character can be. But it's through his fairly wholesome friendship with Chilai that he becomes a bit more sane. I know that a lot of people compare this a lot to like Tarzan or something, with their sort of interesting, this guy is from a different planet and he's a bit less civilized, but he meets a girl who's more civil and takes care of herself. It's not exactly original, but it's done so well that, again, I don't really give a shit. The relationship is totally cliched, but at the same time it's so good and they have such good chemistry that it doesn't even matter. I like that this movie can use cliches that usually bother me, but also allows them to be so nuanced that no one really cares all that much while they're watching the movie. In a sense, Broly is basically the main character of this movie, even though the real protagonists are supposed to be Goku and Vegeta. I think this is fine, because it's not like Goku and Vegeta deserve to be in the background or anything, but they also always get in the way for the story and hog all the attention from other characters. Even when they seem to focus on other characters, they tend to fall back on either of these two, especially Goku for some reason. Broly being basically the main character is great, because it allows for there to be a Dragon Ball villain that's a bit more developed and with an actual arc and personality. Rather than having half-baked motivations or just being evil, Broly can actually be sympathetic and likable. He's not a piece of garbage or anything, but he's just been so looked after and trained to be a killing machine that he just can't think for himself. Overall, I'd probably say that Broly is definitely my new favorite Dragon Ball villain. If you want to talk about most charismatic Dragon Ball villain, then that'd still be Frieza, but I'd argue Frieza nowadays is a bit more stupid. While the main characters don't really get a lot of time for actual development, I liked how they showed different approaches to actually fighting Broly. Vegeta goes first and he goes all out, willing to kill him if he has to. But then Broly gets stronger and stronger, eventually overwhelming him in the process. Goku's fighting style is more feeling the waters. Since he usually fights for honor anyways, he's not really fully going at his best. And he even tries to help Broly because Broly clearly seems to not really be in control of himself. The other characters are just there, kind of like Resurrection F, but they at least don't get too much screen time to the point where the story becomes devoid of tension. I actually like the fact that the cast is a lot smaller this time around, and we don't really see any other side characters besides Bulma and Whis, and Piccolo for like one scene. I'm so glad that unlike the last movie, they don't just add a bunch of random characters for the sake of stupid, pointless fight scenes that are just there to waste your time. Oh yeah, right, speaking of the action sequences, they're absolutely amazing. I remember seeing this in theaters when it came out in the West, and sometimes the audience was straight up cheering during these fights. And that's just because the animation has so much squash and stretch and freedom of movement due to the much simpler style. Along with the really great things like the amazing anticipation and follow through, it just allows the animators to just go all out. It looks magnificent and smooth. The visuals were never bad in these movies, but in Dragon Ball Z Battle of Gods and Resurrection F, I'd say that the art style was a little bit too overly complex and reliant on shading for a lot of the squash and stretch to really feel like it was there. A lot of the action scenes, it's not that they looked bad, it's just they looked sort of slow. But in here it's faster and it makes it just visually orgasmic even. Vegeta and Goku's fight in particular are so amazing to look at. The different ways they go at it, progressing their Super Saiyan form, is so cool to watch even after the first time watching. Considering that Broly gets stronger, it makes the fight more entertaining because one character isn't just getting bodied. The absolute highlight in terms of the fight scenes is the final fight with Broly and Gogeta. Goku and Vegeta get overwhelmed to the point where they have to fuse and beat him. I like this fight because it really shows that the movie's amazing visuals are really carrying the fight. They pretty much abandon all logic, I mean not like there was in the first place, and just go straight up crazy with this animation. They even use CGI here and there within the fight scenes, but unlike the last two movies, it's less jarring and used sparingly, and also just looks better. Also, remember how Resurrection F lacked varied fight locations? Yeah, in this movie, they actually do something that I already mentioned was a cool idea in that last video. Even though it's not planet hopping or going from a cave to a desert or space or anything, they do the thing that I mentioned where they just desecrate the environment and it all looks different. The icy mountains go from, well, icy mountains to being filled with lava. And along with the time of day changes too, it actually makes the fight way more visually interesting. So yeah, no more stupid fucking gray arena with rocks again. I think something else I like about this movie is how it doesn't shove transformations in. Technically, Broly's forms are for the sake of toys as usual, but at the same time, they don't just use the existing lore and just make new forms. But Legendary Super Saiyan and his Super Saiyan form are unique to him, and besides, he's the antagonist of the movie anyways, so it makes sense. Especially with his arc on controlling himself, and since Super Saiyan is activated with rage most of the time. Unlike the other movies, they don't just shoehorn in forms for the sake of toys. Broly's Super Saiyan forms were to show how much control he lacks, and it isn't for the sake of some triumphant victory over struggle like usual, and it's instead tragic somewhat. Besides, honestly, the forms are getting really fucking stupid lately. Dragon Ball Super Broly is just like Battle of Gods. It's a very simple movie, but the simplicity actually works in its favor. It might be simplistic, but it's also grandiose in that simplicity. It has a smaller, more focused cast of characters, the best Dragon Ball villain ever, and amazing art and animation. I still feel like there were some issues, like how some main characters don't really get all that much development, but at the same time, Broly's arc kinda just fills in that void. So overall, it just doesn't matter. I would totally recommend this movie to any Dragon Ball fan because it really is that good. It is the absolute best Dragon Ball movie ever.